as most of you probably know, we invited questions for Andy for this session rather than a sermon, so that you could put to him things that have crossed your mind about what 20 years of ministry in MCC actually means. So we've combined where there were similar questions or duplicates, and we've come up with 9.
You could be here for some.
But there is cake at the back. So.
For after.
So the first one, as with all good interview questions, tell us why you felt called to become a priest.
I became a Christian in my mid-teens. I was always told I was a Roman Catholic, but I had no idea what that meant, because my mother had got disillusioned with the Catholic Church. She converted when she found out about the rules about contraception. So her process of understanding the church wasn't very good. So she got a bit disillusioned in the mid-70s that they hadn't changed the rules on contraception. So I was never brought up going to church. By my mid-teens, I started to explore myself, and I was introduced to the Christian faith by the priest of my local Catholic church. And somewhere in that process, I was drawn to an idea that discipleship meant every aspect of my life. And for me, there became a budging awareness of that was a vocation to priesthood. In those days, I thought it was a vocation to become a Catholic priest. Things got a bit more complicated a few years later, but that wasn't going to happen. So it was to do with the introduction to the Christianity I was given by that first Catholic priest back in the early 1980s.
Second question that came in from people. When did you come out of the closet? And how best would you advise someone to come out and how to deal with the aftermath now?
Friends of mine from that generation tell me I was never in the closet. I don't know quite what they mean by that. I'd like to ask. I was always aware I was different in my teenage years, and as my teenage years wore on, I became conscious that the difference was something to do with sexuality. When I became clear what that difference really was, I spent 2 years asking God to take it away. So coming out for me happened at university. I had to think back, so thank you Lisa for the question, I had to think back when this was. It was 1986, I was in my second year at university. Looking back, you know you do things to tell everybody that you're gay and you haven't actually told them. I was doing some essays on reasons why gay people have been persecuted in the past. Oh gosh, the biggest reason is the church. Oh gosh, why? Because of what some biblical passages say. So coming up was bound up with doing that particular unit on my degree and looking at the scriptural passages for the first time. So 86, what was the aftermath? It was an odd time to come out. The government had just passed, was just about to pass, Section 28, if any of you remember that, of the Local Government Act, which tried to make it illegal to talk about homosexuality in a positive way in schools. There's a big debate about whether actually it had any effect at all, because they misdrafted the law. But it was more about the attitude produced at the time. So one of the first gay things I did was go on a Stop the Clause march, which is interesting. Pride marches in that generation were avowedly political. Pride wasn't about party, Pride was about wanting to change the world. That's changed. And there was also something about public perception. There was no public perception of lesbians. Possibly the film Sister George from the 50s or the 60s, but that was about it when I came out. The only images of gay men in the media was Larry Grayson, John Inman, the very extraordinarily camp figures of fun. And then the other image that was coming out was people that had AIDS. This was the era of the tombstone adverts and the icebergs, and they produced this safer sex literature, but Mrs. Thatcher couldn't quite cope with being explicit, so it was all really difficult to understand what it was we were supposed to do. It was all very strange. So that was the era I came out in. And all that left me with an interesting fusion of faith, sexuality, politics and justice. And it all sort of was bound in together, and I suspect hasn't left me.
So So what about the process of reconciling being gay and being Christian?
It was something to do with the essays, and I remember feeling really angry that there were pro-gay views they'd never told me about. I'd always been told that you couldn't be gay and Christian. And so suddenly I was reading all these people who said, no, yes, you can. And I remember being really cross that the people that said you couldn't had never told me their own point of view. That was quite a naive thing. I was only 18, 19 at the time. The reconciliation was sort of about, well, I am Christian and I am gay. Stonewall do that now, don't they? Some people are gay, some people are Christian, get over it. It was almost that. So the reconciliation was about clearly both. Then was bound up with, in my final year at university, I found MCC, where these areas of life collided.
You came to Manchester in 1996. What was the religious scene like in Manchester when you arrived, and how has it changed over the years?
I think it's always been mixed. As long as I've been in Manchester, it's been an intolerant city. When I arrived here, the gay religion started to take off. MCC, all the time I've been here, was met in other people's buildings, other people's church buildings. So when I first came, we were in an ecumenical chaplaincy, we moved to an Anglican church, now we're here. So we've always been able to have good relationships with our host congregations. Reaction, it's interesting. There are two groups of people I find get quite irritated by MCC, and that's stayed the same. One is evangelical and Pentecostalists who just get irritated anyway. There are a whole range of things, but particularly MCC. And then ministers from other churches that just can't quite cope with the nature of a church like ours. So there was a Methodist minister at the ecumenical chaplaincy who was a really good bloke, but he really struggled to cope with anything in the modern world. Which is odd, he was a student chaplain. But when we came along, he made this very strange statement that he thought that all these splinter churches should go back to where they came from. And a mate of mine was an Anglican priest, said that, yes, and the Methodists should come back to the Anglicans. And he sort of looked a bit, and I said, yes, I think Anglicans should go back to the Catholics. And so they then carried on with their conversation for some time, but I sort of sat there. There was opposition from other gay clergy in mainstream denominations. That's changed, but there was a sense in which I felt our presence, or my presence at meetings, rattled some rather exquisitely apportioned closets. That it was all quite nice, but somehow me being a bit open and a bit direct. And that came mainly in opposition to the mass blessings we did at Pride each year. Some of you have been around some time know we did mass blessings of relationships at Pride as part of the move to show the government that we wanted to have legal recognition to our relationships. And as soon as civil partnerships came in, we stopped, and now we're talking about marriage. But there was a lot of clergy I knew who were gay that felt I was shouting a bit too loud and it was a bit too difficult and I shouldn't be doing things like that. But the clergy that were criticising me generally were gay male clergy in other denominations. And I don't get that. Now I tend to get more wistful attitudes from gay clergy and other denominations. Wouldn't it be nice if my church was accepting as yours? Wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to hide? Or wouldn't it be nice if it was more than acceptance and tolerance, but actual affirmation and equality? And I say things, wouldn't it be nice if I had a pension? So there's swings and roundabouts. There's a lot of freedom in MCC, but I think a lot of clergy would quite like to be with us, but our financial realities are different. So.
Who would you say were your key influences on the decision to go into professional ministry? And over the last 20 years, who has continued to inspire you or inspired you as a new acquaintance?
The seminal influence was the Catholic priest that taught me the Christian faith, a guy called Michael Stewart, who, looking back, I suspect was gay, but I have no idea. You look back and you think, oh, I wonder. He gave me a love of theology because the way he introduced me to the Christian faith was actually very traditional. Any of you have been Catholics, like Jenny Ann and Lynette, remember the catechism?
Yes.
Little so I was at least encouraged to question. You had to come up with the approved answer. But it was an interesting process. So I was always given that opportunity to question and to explore. I arrived in my first MCC congregation as a member almost to the week at the same time as my friend Jane Clark, who some of you know, she's the pastor in Glasgow. So she has been a great influence on the decision to train the ministry. And I think the sense of vocation I'd always had was affirmed again and again by people who were at university. And then, I was looking back, I was a bit naive. I wandered into MCC and they saw me coming. Oh, so you've got a degree in theology. That's interesting. You've always wanted to be a minister. You know, it's just, would you like to preach? It was very quickly, the fellowship doors were opened very wide. But I think Father Michael, from when I was a kid, and Jane, as a, well, I said a kid really, as a 19, 20-year-old coming into MCC. In terms of people along the way, the greatest influence was a woman called Jean White, who pastored our church in London for many years. And she died a couple of years ago, but she was a missionary in China. She was imprisoned by the communists. She was a missionary in Macau and wandered into China every day to do medical missionary work. But during the Cultural Revolution, they basically closed the border and she was still inside China. So she was in prison for 2 years and promised God that if she got out alive, that she'd sort her sexuality out. And she worked with the Rev Andy Braunston, so sorting sexuality out was quite big. And when she did get out, she came out, and she was, I think, the first trained MCC pastor we had in the UK. And so she was a lifelong friend. And then various people in this congregation have had huge impacts upon me over the years. I was like the good impacts then. So some of the long-standing board members, so Margaret and Gwen, who teach, I think, all of us so much about living with difficulty and living with pain and still being able to keep positive, even though it's quite a challenge at times. Philip, he wasn't expecting this, having a clear insight and analysis of situations and being very level-headed when I'm ranting. And Ian, of whom I'll say a little bit more later on.
So, over the past 20 years, if you could pick 3 high points, just 3, what would they be?
In one sense, every Sunday is a high point. As we of all people come together to be church. If you think about it, there is no other church quite like us. And simply the fact that we're here, whether there's 20 of us or 50 of us, simply here, being church, gathered around the Lord's table, is an incredible high point. People that are often told they were wanted, people that are told they're excluded, people that wouldn't dream of going into mainstream churches, come here and be church. But if asked in particular, he can't be here, he's on a train back from London, and of course Moses being Moses missed the train, we could have got him here on time. But when we won the campaign to keep Moses in the UK, when we knew if he went back he'd have been killed. And then when we won Cross's campaign, Crossy is here, when we knew that if she had gone back, she would have been killed. And then getting asylum from the Sood and Fasad and the Jaffa. Saving lives, and often say in MCC we save lives, and we sort of mean about how can people be psychologically better. But in those cases, we actually save lives. A few years ago, I was asked to preach in Trinity College Dublin, of all places, which is very odd. It's the Oxford of Ireland. And a year before, I've been asked to take part in a debate there, in a debating society. And it's like every president of Ireland has been a member of this debating society. Every Prime Minister of Ireland has been to Trinity College. So a little bit out of my depth. And then I was asked to go back and preach. And I was doing okay when we got there. It's lavish hospitality, just saw the visitors book, and Mary Robinson, and Nelson Mandela, and Bill Clinton's So that was interesting. And talking to people who will in 20, 30 years be the opinion formers and politicians in the Republic. That was interesting. And then the more mundane really, the celebrating of weddings and baptisms. Most clergy will tell you they prefer funerals. The reason for that is the customer doesn't complain that much. You don't need to do rehearsals. But I really like doing weddings for people I know, for people who have struggled to find their partner, to maintain a relationship in a climate which still can be quite hostile. And that gives me a big kick. So in the last year, we've married Jenny and Ellen and Trini and Katrina and their high-points. And baptisms, when adults come to faith and want to be baptised, but particularly kids. So we baptised Aidan and Nate in the last year, and that's really, really fun. And to see our church growing biologically. Who'd have thought?
So, sticking with the theme of 20 years, in the next 20 years, where do you see MCC being, bearing in mind that things like gay marriage seem to be becoming a real possibility? Do we have a role?
Read the next question and answer the next one with it.
Should there be a shift in ministry in MCC? Yes, they are together. Should there be a shift in ministry in MCC? Should the role primarily be to provide pastoral support so that people can go back into mainstream churches and become fully integrated? Or should we be challenging mainstream churches to create pastoral ministries for their own LGBT members? In which case, might there be no role for us in the longer term?
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Steve. They're really easy questions. I think they're fascinating questions. I think they boil down to is there a future? What is the future for our ministry? And I've got lots of different answers with lots of different perspectives, but no one answer. So you'll have to bear with me. It is a conversation that I think we'll be having as a congregation, as a denomination for the next few years. When Troy started MCC, he naively believed it wouldn't be around for very long because the other churches would realise that, of course, it's obvious that you should accept LGBT people. But 42 years on, the obviousness doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. So that view changed. In the West, the Christian church is declining, but the largest area of growth within that declining overall church is evangelical Pentecostalism. And they're not changing anytime soon. The next largest area is Catholicism. And that is increasing in the West through to immigration. I think evangelical Pentecostalism is increasing through conversion. I think Catholicism is increasing through large-scale immigration into the West from various parts of the UK. Various parts of the rest of the world. Sorry, the Masood coming in this matter. I talked about you already, Masood, so you've missed a bit of embarrassing news. But the rest of the church that isn't evangelical or Pentecostal, that isn't Roman Catholic, is becoming more and more inclusive and accepting. And I think that gives us some challenges. I don't know how accepting it is. I was privileged to go to the United Reformed Church's General Assembly, and everyone was getting very, very excited about their debate on civil partnerships. It's really quite boring. They get more heated about the pension debate than they do about civil partnerships. And the only debate about civil partnerships was the process they used for the voting didn't go quite as someone wanted. We had more heat about the process of the vote than whether or not civil partnerships could happen in URC churches. So that was quite interesting, and lots of people went out of their way to be very welcoming to me and say how good it was that I was there. At the same time, I got talking to a retired minister who's lovely, who was sent to look after the ecumenical guests. And she was talking about how, it's taken her some time, but she is quite welcoming of gay folks in her church now. A couple ran and asked if they could come along. And I'm saying, yes, but you can't flaunt it. And I did question how much flaunting they thought would happen in a hidden prayer sandwich at 10:30 on Sunday morning. Maybe her church is more exciting than mine. And I sort of said, well, would you object? And what she meant was holding hands. And I did, so I think it's patchy in other churches. I've been amazed at how welcoming and wonderful Anglican bishops are to civil partnerships. 5 years ago, they hated civil partnerships and made them really quite restrictive when they had the vote in the House of Lords. Now it looks like a Conservative government of all things is going to give us gay marriage. They're singing the praise of civil partnerships. It's quite fun. Many Anglican priests are really welcoming, but is the parish as well? What if they move on? Many Anglican priests would love to offer gay weddings to people in their community. The bishops are acting like they're denying the Trinity for even thinking about it. So there is still, there's problems, but it's better than it was 20 years ago. One of my lecturers on my MA programme thinks it's too early to decide whether the church will change. We haven't been talking about it long enough. And he's a specialist in the early church. He said it took 100 years to work out the Trinity. So maybe we just haven't been talking long enough about gay stuff. Then there's a perspective about the nearest parallel, I can think, to MCC are the black-led churches. Now, most Christians of whatever denomination, for a range of reasons we can only guess at, don't get too excited by the fact that black-led churches exist. No one says it's wrong to have a black-led church. Why? Because they realise that black-led churches exist in the UK because of the racism of the white majority churches. And whilst there are black people in all denominations, many black people prefer to worship in a black majority church because they want to go somewhere where they're treated with equality, where they minister, not where they're ministered to. And that might be a parallel for MCC. There might always be a proportion of the LGBT community who want more than tolerance. Whether that means we do that as local congregations in partnership with established denominations, whether that means we continue as a little and rather insignificant denomination, I don't know. But I think there's always going to be a need for an LGBT-focused ministry which has more credibility with our community than churches which have persecuted us for years. At the same time, I don't know who else would be able to call our people to discipleship and to say some hard things. Like, if we behave like that, it's not good for us. But actually, there's a biblical idea in the Old Testament, you were once strangers in Egypt, you must treat the strangers amongst you well. So there's a sense in which we need to take our eyes off the LGBT stuff, because after a while it's quite boring, and think about other justice issues which God's also concerned about. There's a whole sequence of ideas, none of which are very well thought out yet. But I don't know if they answer your two questions or not. You're nodding and smiling, you're looking puzzled. So.
20 years to see if you're right.
Let's talk about something that's going to reveal hidden choices.
Last question. Your relationship with Ian, your partnership, how has it helped your ministry and what part has Ian played in that?
Ministry is collaborative, and I think clergy will look very silly without anyone to minister to or with. One of my interests in ministry is about what we do together, so that we try and give expression to that in any Sunday service, where it's a very unusual Sunday when it's just me doing everything up front. We normally have 4 or 5 of us taking different parts of the service. That's how we work best, that's how we do government in our church. But I think the relationship a minister has with her or his partner is paramount to the impact they have everywhere else. And without Ian, I couldn't fully be myself. He's calm, he's reflective, he loves me no matter what, he reminds me to take it easy, to have a different perspective. There's no need to be enrolled with him. I'm not someone that easily goes into a sort of professional role. I think it's one of the criticisms of me. But I am aware that there's always, you can't just always say exactly what you're thinking, because you'll disappear. But with Ian, I don't need to be enrolled. He helps me restore perspective and see a bigger picture. He helps me pace myself for the long view and is sufficiently detached to be objective. And he does all this with a demanding career in his own right as a clinical psychologist who, having got a doctorate, that wasn't enough, so was just qualified with a master's in family therapy. He's as committed to justice issues as I am, but also puts them into practice, so that over the years has graciously opened his home, our home, to Moses and Sood and now the Son. So it's not quite taking your work home with you, but it is, in a sense, giving a very visible expression in his love and his generosity to what we try to do in the church. And the one thing I've noticed most is that since I've been fitted with hearing aids this week, for some reason it's projecting his voice much better.
Thank you everybody for your questions. I hope you found that entertaining. I think our pastor deserves a round of applause.